Good morning, partners and colleagues, and thank you for making space in your busy schedules to join us for the webinar on accelerating the Philippines' renewable energy transition, emerging policy developments, and lessons learned from Vietnam, co-presented by the Clean Energy Investment Accelerator and the Philippines National Renewable Energy Board. We know these are challenging times for everyone, so we appreciate that you could all join. I am Marlon Joseph Apanyada, Southeast Asia Engagement Lead for Climate and Energy for the World Resources Institute, or WRI, and I am excited to host today's webinar, especially as we have been able to assemble the best possible set of panelists and speakers for such a timely and impactful virtual event. Next slide, please. On your screen is a quick guide on how we will proceed with today's live webinar. To reach a broader audience, this webinar will be recorded. We will also be sending the link of the recording after the event. But never have we seen the big three of energy government bodies, the Energy Regulatory Commission, the National Renewable Energy Board, and the Department of Energy, alongside the energy arm of the country's oldest conglomerate and leading Vietnam experts in one room, virtually or otherwise. So we truly hope you could join us live and throw in questions for the full 1.5 hours of virtual discussion. Next slide, please. This webinar is brought to you by the NREB alongside the Clean Energy Investment Accelerator, or CEIA. CEIA is an innovative public-private partnership that addresses barriers to scale the deployment of clean energy solutions for commercial and industrial consumers in emerging markets like the Philippines. The CEIA is jointly led by the World Resources Institute, or WRI, Allotrope Partners, and the United States National Renewable Energy Laboratory, or NREL, and supported by the German and US governments and other donors. Next slide, please. We start this morning with two framing slides. First is that more and more multinational and large corporates are pledging to use 100% RE and into other sustainability commitments through programs such as RE100 and the Renewable Energy Buyers Alliance. And 107 of such companies have operations in the Philippines. For example, a company like Apple has a supplier clean energy program, and they have 2 suppliers in the Philippines who are now looking into solutions to source 100% of their electricity from RE. But they are in the weeds on how to go about it. And because solutions that exist in other countries, like off-site power purchase agreements and market tradable renewable energy certificates, or RECs, do not yet exist here in the Philippines. A company like Toyota has time-bound 100% RE targets as well, down to its ecosystem of suppliers, and is facing the same predicament. What we know is that, one, these companies are not able to proceed with 100% RE procurement given policy and regulatory constraints here, and 2, that being able to set the environment for renewables procurement is now part of the national competitiveness story. Next slide, please. And speaking of competitiveness and competition, ground-mounted solar installation in the Philippines has not seen significant growth in the last 3.5 years. In comparison, in the last 2 years, Vietnam was able to install 4,600 megawatts of ground-mounted solar. For rooftop solar, the story is the same, and the Philippines has been lagging rather behind Vietnam's. We only have installed no more than 110 megawatts of rooftop solar in 10 years compared to Vietnam's rooftop market, which grew from practically zero to over 570 megawatts in 2 years. We will hear from our experts in Vietnam on how our neighbor was able to do this. But those numbers do make us reflect a little on where we are now and what we can and need to do. Next slide, please. In today's live webinar, we are joined by Attorney Mona de Malanta, Chairperson of the National Renewable Energy Board, who will be presenting on the ongoing RE policies, as well as the country's national renewable energy plans. With her representing the regulators is the Honorable Chairperson, Ms. Agnes de Vanadera. Hello, ma'am. Chairperson of the Energy Regulatory Commission, and Department of Energy Undersecretary Felix William Wimpy Pentebella is also here. We also have Vietnam experts, Mr. Evan Scanling and Dr. Hang Dao here with us to share lessons on how Vietnam was able to accelerate its RE transition. We are also joined by Mr. John Eric Francia, President of AC Energy, President and CEO of AC Energy, who will be sharing his insights on what key levers are needed to achieve AC Energy's plans towards regional renewables leadership. Next slide, please. As I introduce the next speaker, please read some of the questions we wish to answer during the course of this live webinar. Please feel free to raise additional and supporting questions on the Q&A box in Zoom at any time during the program, and we will do our best to raise them to our panelists. Next slide, please. With that, I want to formally introduce Attorney Mona de Malanta as our first speaker. Attorney de Malanta is presently the chair of the Philippine National Renewable Energy Board. She's also a partner in PJS Law, and until her assumption of office as NREB chair, led the energy group of the firm. Attorney Mona is a recognized market leader in the areas of project development and energy, and a leading practitioner in the Asia Pacific, and has been instrumental in organizing this event, as she is keen on growing investments into the Philippine RE space and identifying the pain points of RE developers in the country. Attorney Mona, the virtual stage is all yours.
Thanks, Marlon. Thanks, everyone. Good morning. Magandang umaga po sa mga kaibigan natin dito sa Pilipinas na nanonood ngayon. Good morning to our colleagues and friends in Vietnam and other parts of the region. I'm heartened by the participation, not only of course, of our recognized chair of the Energy Regulatory Commission and Undersecretary Pentebella of the Department of Energy, and of course, AC Energy, but also because we have currently, I'm looking at the screen, we have 266 participants, or 267 as I was speaking, already registered. And this is not counting those who are watching via Facebook. So I'm quite encouraged by the interest of everyone. I hope this translates also to actual interest and investments in the Philippine RE space. So for today, I was asked to present the National Renewable Energy Plan, what is up with the NREB, and what we anticipate to be doing in the next few months for the National Renewable Energy Plan. I call this, or I titled the presentation Road to Revival, because I think you'll see later in the first stage, I want to tell a story. I want to tell the story of the Philippine RE sector. Can we go to the next slide, please? So the Philippines has had a very long history with renewables. It dates all the way back to 1936. I like starting with this slide or with this story because it puts everything in perspective, at least to me and to those who appreciate the energy journey that the Philippines has had over the last over the many decades that we have in growing this sector. So it starts with 1936, the charter that created the National Power Commission, National Power Corporation, sorry, the NAPOCOR, with the clear mandate to develop hydropower resources in the Philippines. So with the key GOCC, Government Corporation, given instructions by the state to develop hydropower resources, we can claim this milestone as the beginning of the RE story of the Philippines, the beginning of our journey in renewable energy. It grew in 1971 when the charter of NPC was revised so that it became a stock corporation and given the mandate to explore not just hydropower resources, but also geothermal resources. This was further underscored in 1978 when Presidential Decree 1442 was passed, allowing private sector to also explore geothermal resources in the Philippines. So just by this alone, from 1930s to the 1970s, we can already see that the focus of the Philippines was really on renewable energy. In 1991, the Mini Hydro Act was passed, Mini Hydro Law was passed to develop mini hydro resources by private sector. So alongside the government sector, via NAPOCOR developing the large hydros, the private sector was now allowed to go into mini hydro development. From that period onward to around 2007, there were also developments in exploring ocean, solar, and wind resources via issuances by the Department of Energy. All of these led to what we now recognize as the law that consolidates all the government's efforts, all the nation's efforts towards promoting renewable energy. And this was passed in December 2008 with the Renewable Energy Act, which is the RA, Republic Act 9513. The goal of RA 9513 is really to accelerate the promotion of renewable energy. So you can see that the Philippines' commitment to renewable energy, it's not just something that was, that was passed on by our grandfathers and our older generation that dates back to the 1930s. It was further affirmed in 2008 by this generation that we want renewable energy, we will grow renewable energy that we currently have. And what was the state of renewable energy at that time? When the RE Act was passed back in 2008, renewable energy already accounted for less than 40%, around 40%, 35 to 40% of our energy mix. So that was our starting point. We wanted from 35 to 40% to further grow the share of renewable energy by the passage of the Renewable Energy Act. Next slide, please. How was this supposed to be done? So the RE Act had several programs that were aimed at accelerating this growth. Okay, in the on-grid areas, there were what we call the fiscal incentives and the non-fiscal incentives. Fiscal incentives, I think a lot of the developers here in this webinar will be familiar with this. The income tax holiday, the exemptions from certain tariffs and all that. But I think the real growth was really, or the radical portion of the law was really on the non-fiscal incentives. These are what I call the market maker portion of the law. The renewable portfolio standard, the feed-in tariff system, the net metering system, and the green energy option program. This comprise the basket of non-fiscal incentives. And we're only talking about the on-grid areas here. In the off-grid areas, there's also a recognition that we need to develop renewable energy resources in the off-grid areas via fiscal incentives as well, including cash incentives for developers for missionary electrification, as well as the counterpart of the on-grid area RPS, the sourcing of minimum percentage of total generation from RE available in the area. So this is in a very quick snapshot, because I'm only given 10 minutes for this presentation, what the RE Act mapped out as a road towards increasing, remember, increasing the 35 to 40% share of RE when we started out the RE Act. Next slide, please. So what was the target? The target was what was encapsulated in, also mandated by the RE Act, the National Renewable Energy Program, or NREP. It was developed first in 2009, covering a 20-year period, 2010 to 2030, and it tracked for us what our targets are in terms of in 5-year increments. So the goal, I'll just direct you to the bottom right of the table. The goal is to triple the capacity by 2030. So from what we had in 2010, which was when the NREP was passed, 5,438 megawatts in capacity in 2010. The target was to triple that to 15,000 megawatt by 2040. Allocated along the resources that have been identified by the Act. Next slide, please. So how did we do? How do we do? Actually, we're still at this. You can see in the slides that we are very, very far from the target. And I think what is quite telling here is how far we are on certain resources and how we have exceeded in certain resources. If you recall in the earlier slide, for geothermal, we're now in year 2020, so we can clearly map it out. For geothermal, we were targeting additional 1,100 megawatts of capacity by 2020. Today, as of 2019, so as of last year, we only had an increase of 82 megawatts, 82.5 megawatts in geothermal. For hydro, we were targeting as of 2020 additional 3,000 megawatts. And you can see in the screen for hydro as of end 2019, we only had 261 megawatts in additional. But this is the other story. If you look at solar, we were targeting, based on the NREB, just by 2020, additional 260 to about 275 megawatts of solar. Now we already have 958 megawatts of solar capacity as of end 2019. That's heartening for solar, but also makes you take a pause on what needs to be done for the other resources. This is talking about capacity. I invite you to look at the next slide. Because the other dimension, can you go to the next slide, please? The other dimension here, it's not just, can you go to the next slide, please? So not just about capacity, but more importantly, I think, is our share in the generation mix. In 2014, renewable energy was, the supply mix attributable to renewable energy was at 24.64%. Recall that when we started, I mentioned this at least twice, and I made sure I mentioned it at least twice. When the RE Act was passed in 2008, we were already at 35 to 40% of the mix. In 2014, 6 years from the time the law was passed, we were down to 25%. As of end 2018, the numbers have been going down, and as of end 2018, it was at 23%. I think 2019 was 21%. So this to me is the real story. So apart from the capacity that we have not realized, it's the share in the mix that keeps on dwindling, that makes us pause. I think, next slide, please. I think this demands a review, considering that this is taken from the Power Development Plan. This is the supply-demand outlook that was presented by the Department of Energy under a high GDP scenario. We're looking at the Philippines still requiring additional more than 45,000 megawatts of capacity by 2040, what portion of this 45,000 megawatts of capacity should be taken by RE? And this, I think, to me, is the compelling reason. We need to be more deliberate. We need to be more decisive in terms of allocating or targeting the share of RE for this anticipated increase in capacity or required increase in capacity. Next slide. This to me makes it imperative to update the National Renewable Energy Plan. We started this last year because when we realized the NREB has been 10 years old and it has not been updated since. The costs have changed dramatically for some technologies. The projections have changed for demand. So it really requires a lot of updating. Next slide, please. So what does this update require of us? I'd like to acknowledge that I really want to give credit to the DOE in taking on a shift in perspective, and this has come about in the many hours of discussion, many months of discussion with DOE. And DOE, maybe we can ask more from Yusek Puentebella later, has taken on a shift in perspective from a grid-centered approach to a consumer-centered use of the RE systems. And they have three baskets for this approach: a consumer-only set of programs, a consumer DU set of programs, and consumer DU systems type of programs. And we can maybe ask DOE later to talk about this. But this is to me a step in the right direction, a step in more towards the RE direction, and allows us to now be more emboldened in revisiting the fundamentals of the National Renewable Energy Plan. Next slide, please. So what does it take to revisit the fundamentals? I think RE today is no longer alternative in the system. Even when the RE Act was passed, if the share is already at 35 to 40%, I think RE credibly is a priority or consists of the core supply in the Philippines. It is a bit of a misnomer to consider it alternative energy when the law clearly mandates a priority for the resource. We also need to change the metrics a bit from just talking about megawatts or capacity to megawatts and megawatt hours, because as we have seen, while in terms of capacity, for example, there is already a gap that we recognize, but the gap becomes real, the gap becomes huge when we start talking about megawatt hours. And this allows us to properly craft a design for addressing the issues of RE so that we can track the growth even more accurately. We also need to use the same language, I put that in quotes, and planning tools in preparing the power development plan. Currently, the plans are developed side by side, but I'd like that to be integrated, and I'm so happy that DOE also considers it acceptable that the National Renewable Energy Plan should form part of the power development plan and not just an alongside plan for renewable energy. We need to be demand-driven in our projections, because this is not just about developing projects, developing plants, but the plants have to be properly tracked in that supply-demand projection curve that I showed earlier. We also need some market unlocking measures. As DOE shifts perspective from a grid-centered to a consumer-centric market, we need to unlock the consumer market with programs allowing for distributed energy and adoption of corporate PPAs. Next slide, please. We also need to recognize...
Final
yes.
wrap up, Attorney, sorry.
Sige. Okay, I'll end with this slide. So the LGUs have to be seen as the primary champions of RE. DOE has already, with the DILG, enacted the Energy Code, which will, I think, empower the LGUs more closely to identify the resources in their areas so that they can be the building blocks of the National Renewable Energy Plan. I also propose an energy transition audit. If we are committed to transitioning to more RE, to greater RE resources, we need to track what's out there. And we need to identify not just the assets or the programs and laws currently in place, but we need to also review, and I'm glad that our ERC chair is here, the regulatory framework for energy pricing so that we recognize all the cost components for all these energy resources that we have. Finally, market-based and resource-specific support programs need to be crafted so that we can also address the issues that we have already identified in the review of the NREB. And we need to capacitate our consumers for them to ably participate in these new programs. Okay, thank you. We can perhaps address questions later. We have more slides, but we ran out of time. Thank you for your time. Thank you for listening.
Yes, thank you, Attorney Mona, for this very helpful overview of the Philippine National Renewable Energy Plan. And then we actually have in one virtual room the big three of energy government bodies, the ERC, NREB, and the DOE, represented by USEC Wimpy Fantabella for our first set of Q&As. We hope to have this in 15 minutes. And we will revisit your slides, Attorney Mona, as we have these questions because
no problem.
Those are very important recommendations, very eye-opening. And these are all these are the information that everyone has been waiting for. Before we answer the questions, I would like to introduce Chairperson and CEO of the Energy Regulatory Commission, Honorable Agnes de Vanadera. A trailblazer, Attorney de Vanadera is a woman of many firsts. First woman government corporate counsel, first woman solicitor general, and first woman to be a full-fledged secretary of justice, among many others. As chairperson and CEO of the ERC, she believes that the ERC should not just be a regulator, but also an enabler that drives the necessary changes and provides time-sensitive solutions so that the ERC can truly and meaningfully be part of and partner of country's nation building. And as we open this Q&A, to Chairperson De Venadera, Attorney Mona mentioned that we need to be more decisive and deliberate in allocating RE share, and RE is no longer alternative but priority. What are your thoughts on that, Honorable Chairperson? And then what are concrete steps that the ERC is taking to act on this recommendation and insight?
Okay, let me start with what are the deliverables of ERC for this year. And we have to deliver on our regulatory framework for DR, for JO, and for the RPS and RE market. But of course, there are prerequisites before we can even come up with those regulatory framework. However, at this point in time, we already have some of this in writing in our drafts, but with COVID-19, this will have to be given a real review because one, the demand profile has changed, and now we're seeing that it's really important that we change from grid-centered approach to consumer-centered use. And we will also have to look into the ownership or citizenship requirements that is being imposed by no less than the Constitution. And then we have such things as the BESS or the battery energy storage. So we have to determine whether it should be CAPEX, it should be under PSA. And so how do we address all this in line and in tandem with NREB? This might be the golden opportunity for RE because we have to do a review of the most strategic approach in doing our regulatory framework. Timeline, we are committed to do it in 2020. Details, we have to sit down with NREB. Comments, we have been posting that's our usual, we have been posting our draft or proposed rules and regulations, and I would really call and ask everybody to participate. And in addition to that, we shall be coming up with focus group discussions. I'm sorry I have to dish everything out in so short a time, and not just the pointers raised by NREB. These are the things that we think we should be doing so that your regulator will not just be coming up with regulatory framework, but also help everybody out so that we should be the enabler. We shouldn't be just looking at the rules, but we should be looking at how we can really push the RE and attain our targets.
Wow. Thanks so much, Chairperson. As we have this shift from just rules into push, how are we gonna engage with the ERC? Are virtual meetings, virtual hearings gonna be the norm now? And how are we gonna go about it? Because before we all go to Ortigas and have these hearings, now we will have all these virtual rooms.
You want me to answer? If you look at our website, we have already posted.
Yes, yes, Chairperson.
Yeah. Okay. if you will look at our website, you will see that we have already posted our e-rules on filing and even on e-hearings, e-PubCon. We shall be coming out with that. And our target is by middle of July, we should be having our e-filing. So that's the norm now. And this is the reason why we think we can go faster than, well, this is the other side, the brighter side of COVID-19. We're forced to do the virtual hearings, virtual meetings, virtual consultations, and the e-filings.
Okay, thank you, Chairperson. And this question is directed to Yusek Wimpy Pantabella. As one of the main proponents in shifting the energy policies from grid-centered approach to consumer-centered use of RE, what does it mean in concrete terms in the investment attraction and pipeline building perspective? And can you give insights on that, Yusek?
Yeah, what we noticed was that the developers were focusing on the incentives that are connected to the grid. When we reviewed the RE law, we reviewed the use of the language RE systems. And since there are a lot of improvements in the technology, we wanted to focus on what the consumer would need in agriculture, in health, in food production, in business, in schooling. So what we saw is that we have neglected the RE systems that are only for consumers. In fact, it's only recently that we had an agreement with the Department of Trade and Industry, same with Ma'am Agnes. That's the positive things of COVID. We agreed to have standards for biomass components, solar, hydro, and wind, so that when we present the RE systems to customers, it will be of better quality. So that's what the Secretary said. And in fact, in the Philippines, we have President Duterte giving us a marching order in the State of the Nation address for the Department of Energy to look into the more use of renewable energy.
Thank you, Yusek. And we have a question from our Q&A chat room, which is very interesting because, and I asked Attorney Mona first, and then maybe Chair Yusek as well. How has COVID-19 affected PH's energy transition targets, either negatively or positively? Attorney Mona, do you want to chime in?
Okay. I think I'd like to answer that in two ways. First, in terms of the projects that are in development, early on in the ECQ, I think after a week into ECQ, the NREB, we already checked on the RE projects in development just to make sure that everything's on track. Is there anything that they need in terms of assistance from us that we can facilitate so that there's no delay in the development of their projects? And the DOE and the ERC have been very responsive. And I think it's widely recognized that in the energy sector, the effect of the ECQ in particular has not been that dramatic in terms of the project development, because the agencies have been very responsive and quite committed to ensuring that people get what they need. Secondly, I think in terms of demand, as Chair Agnes had said, this is the time to validate. And that's one of the slides that I was not able to get to. It's the validation of projections. But because I think we all recognize that we need to, and the DUs have been given this directive already by DOE to revisit their projections, because there has been a reduction of demand, or I'd like to think a shift in demand from the commercial or industrial sector demand. It now shifts to the residential. It looks like it's just flattening or shifting of the demand, but there are economic implications to that as well. If the demand is now going into or increasing in the residential sector, so that's part of the ongoing review process. I'm just not sure about the status of the review at the moment, but the review is ongoing. Maybe
Yusek, do you have
Okay, for the Department of Energy, what COVID did to us was we really had to improve ourselves in using technology. Good thing is we are in the process of rolling out the Energy Virtual One-Stop Shop Act. So it basically provides the regulation to the regulators. So all the agencies of governments in adopting or processing the permits, we should do it online payment also with very strict. So we are doing, we are using technology so much right now with the timelines. Also, our targets because of the changes, more consumer centered, which is good because now the shift is from commercial to industrial, more on residential consumption. And that's the good thing is we have been having very good partnerships with the Energy Regulatory Commission. I don't know if Ma'am Agnes noticed, but lately in the congressional hearings and congressional reports that we have been giving, we were always attuned. We were always synchronized with our advisories, with our policies, and I hope that the communication, the easier way of communicating through technology would continue, even if we will not be here and the next group of guys would be running either agencies. It should continue. The use of technology is really helping us. That's a positive side.
Okay, and speaking.
Yes, may I just interject?
For sure, Chairperson.
Okay. Well, in ERC, we have written our regulated agencies for them to review their pending applications vis-a-vis their development plans. Because we have, in ERC, we have lined up all the cases that should be come on deck for by month and by quarter and for 2020. And we're seeing that a lot of this, most of this are actually to serve tourist destinations. With COVID-19, it is important, as I said, that since there is a change in the demand profile, we have asked our regulated agencies to review so that we can do some prioritization on the action on what should be resolved by ERC.
Okay, thank you so much, Yusek, Chairperson. We will just have one room for a question, and we will have like the bigger interactive discussion later. One of the things that everyone has been keenly monitoring are the green auctions and the green tariffs, because these are part and parcel of the consumer-oriented, and this is what the consumers wanted. Are there any developments, updates you can share on these green auctions and green tariff programs?
Yeah, we are in the process of finalizing the policy. When we say finalizing, we have been finalizing it for like 3 weeks already, because at the end of the day, we really have to make sure that when we draw the diagram or the processes, how it will be done, it should pass the standards of the Energy Regulatory Commission. Bearing in mind that good relations with the ERC is not enough, we should comply with the standards of the law, because otherwise, if we see a loophole in the design that we do for the green energy auction program, I'm sure the ERC may not also support it. So We make sure that all the bases are covered. The contracts between the supplier, the one purchasing, and the market operator is all in line with the law, especially so that Ma'am Agnes is a legal luminary here in the country. So, and Attorney Mona, as one of the lead lawyers, female lawyers also in this country in energy law, she also teaches. So we have to really make sure that it will pass the standards of Ma'am Agnes and the energy regulatory commissioners.
Okay, we can pause a bit for this Q&A, and then we will have an interactive discussion later. I'm well aware of that time, and we can proceed with the next our esteemed experts from Vietnam. And this conversation is really worthy of being its own webinar. And we can have the rest of the questions from the chat in the open discussion after the presentations. And in the meantime, to provide a perspective from the Vietnam market, which has been dominating the news with its astonishingly quick growth, I would like to welcome our colleagues from Vietnam, Dr. Hang Dao, advisor on the Clean Energy Investment Accelerator, and Mr. Evan Scandling, Director for Southeast Asia of Allotrope Partners, to present on renewable energy acceleration in Vietnam, lessons learned and responding to challenges. Hello, Dr. Hang and Evan, the screen is yours.
Okay, thank you, Marlon. I am going to share my screen here, so just give me a moment. Gabriel, it says my screen cannot be shared. So is that something I can do, or will you be controlling it, Gabriel?
I think you're already sharing it.
I can see your screen, but I'm not sure whose screen is that. Is Evan or Gabriel?
It looks like Gabriel has my slides. So Gabriel, if you control my slides, or yeah, I had a few changes, but let's see if there we go. Now I can control my slides. Here we go. Sorry about that. Thank you, Gabriel. All right, can everybody see my slides here?
Yes, we can.
Fantastic. Okay. So fortunately, Marlon already gave us a nice introduction about the CEIA, so I can skip over that. One key point here I'd like to share is that from my perspective, and Dr. Hong, who will be speaking here after me on the back half of this, is the core of our work in Vietnam and the other countries we work in, including the Philippines, has usually been focused on corporate energy users. So that's our lens that we're looking at renewable energy issues in Vietnam. So I know Marlon's been very kind in calling us Vietnam experts, but that is our lens that we're looking at. And we certainly do not have the level of expertise as the big three coming from the Philippines that spoke before us. So if you recognize that before we launch into our presentation. So I will start for the first few minutes here, just providing the big picture of where is Vietnam from a macro perspective in terms of the economy, the energy demand, and look at a bit of the big picture. I mean, there's a lot to talk about here. Like Marlon said, this could be a full webinar in itself. So give some of the very big highlights of what Vietnam has seen in terms of renewable energy growth in the last couple of years. And then I'll turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Hong, and she'll get into more of the details about how has this growth happened and some of the key learnings that Vietnam has seen and some of the key players that have made that activity happen. So with that, as a scene setter to really look at the context of Vietnam as a whole, not just as an electricity market, but as an economy. Over here on the left side, I have just a few very high-level key points about the economy. The key point being is Vietnam, when you look at Southeast Asia or Asia Pacific as a whole, Vietnam really stands at the top of many lists or most lists of fastest growing economies, and looking out over the next decade as an economy that really is expected to continue growing quite a bit. One point to point out here is I found this quite interesting, and again, we'll see how this plays out. Nobody knows right now. We're in the middle of the pandemic, but I believe this was a World Bank statistic saying that Before the pandemic, Vietnam had a projected 6.8% growth rate for this coming year. Taking into account the effects of the pandemic, they're still looking at roughly a 5% growth rate, which is quite impressive compared to some other countries that are seeing a much more negative impact to their economies. So that's something really important to keep in mind here in terms of electricity demand and companies that are looking to invest. The economy actually still, as of now, again, take that with an asterisk, as of now has shown to be quite resilient in the last few months. One other key point on the left side here, Vietnam very much has built itself around attracting foreign investment. I think that's a key point to keep in mind here. Marlon led off the webinar. I like that one of the first slides was talking about some of those large FDI investors in the Philippines, but also in Vietnam that are looking at procuring clean energy in very significant volumes. And that certainly plays into Vietnam's overall economy, being able to attract large companies like that and be able to answer to their demands and their objectives of climate goals, renewable energy goals. Vietnam as a power system is quite interesting as well. They largely due to the economic growth that we talked about here over the next 10 years or more, we're looking at almost very close to a tripling of the installed capacity of power generation. From today, we're at about 50 megawatts in Vietnam, and by the end of the decade, we'll need to be somewhere around 135 gigawatts. So that translates, if that stays on track, that will require approximately $10 billion a year for the power generation and the transmission and distribution. So that feeds into all of these conversations as well of where does that money come from? That's a significant amount of capital that will be required both from domestic sources as well as we've seen in recent years, some regional investors. And then I think the next step beyond that is looking at global investors coming in to contribute to that large pool of capital needed. Also really important here, another interesting piece down here at the bottom middle, Vietnam, actually interesting, despite all of this growth of power generation that we're talking about, they are still at risk of power shortages as early as next year in 2021 at quite a large gap that they could see. Roughly 5% of their annual generation might be short of that target. So that's also a very key ingredient here when we're talking about scaling up the power system rapidly. They're trying to catch up and meet that demand. And then thirdly, the other area is looking at how is the power system and how is the economy growing in a way to hopefully meet the targets that Vietnam as a country and as a government have set for themselves in terms of the Paris Agreement. It's really interesting and somewhat frightening, depending on your perspective, to look at right now the greenhouse gas from emissions from the entire country is about 53% from the energy sector. It's projected that within the end of this decade, that could be up to 80% if things continue business as usual. So how can Vietnam actually get to that 25% by 2030 Paris Agreement goal when taken into context of these other factors here? And then lastly on this slide, probably one of the most important here in this story, Vietnam is just in the first few steps of its liberalization. I think obviously we have a Philippine focused audience here. You guys as a country and as a power market are several steps ahead in terms of liberalization. In Vietnam, that's a very important factor, looking at the buying and the selling and investing and opening up the market to be more competitive. So to get to the story that Marlon referenced, and a lot of news articles in the last year or so about Vietnam really being a key place, somewhat of a gold rush for solar and wind investment. So this slide here is meant to just give a quick snapshot of really all the different areas of renewable energy that are being supported and are growing in Vietnam right now. So starting with solar, you look at each one of these, and I won't go through each one, but the main point is whether it's utility scale, ground mounted, or floating, or rooftop solar for commercial, industrial, or rooftop solar for residential. The key point is the mechanisms put in place by the government are attractive across the board for in meaning that the result is that all those areas there highlighted are growing and seeing investment. So that's a key point to show, and I'll give some more examples about what the incentives were put in place to stimulate that. But the fact is that the government of Vietnam didn't just pick out one or maybe two areas to really emphasize it. They're really going all in and supporting all these areas. Same with wind power. It's not just onshore, it's not just offshore. They're putting a big, strong push to both areas. And then lastly, we'll talk about this in a bit, and I think Marlon mentioned this, the direct power purchase agreement, which is in some markets known as a virtual PPA, so off-site transactions between businesses. So getting back to what I referenced a few seconds ago about the country is in the first steps of its power market liberalization, the DPPA program, which is designed for industrial power users to be able to contract renewables, is a really important step in this. To give a few quick details, definitely won't talk about each point here, but really the key point here for looking at large scale solar in Vietnam going about 2.5 years ago, when decision 11, which was really the game changer for solar in Vietnam, was passed. Feed-in tariff for 9.35 US cents for a 20-year PPA with the utility EVN. They started that when they first passed that and set the program or opened the program, a target of 850 megawatts. What's really important to highlight here is that resulted in more than 5,000 megawatts in about 1.5 years being invested into, being built, and now operating. So it really, the key point here is they had a decent target of 850, and it just went way above and beyond that. And that speaks to really the mechanisms and the support that they put in place, and obviously the interest and willingness of the investors and private sector to come in. And also, it's important to point out that was I think for the most part a very big success, but they did not just stop there. Just last month in April, the next solar decision was passed, decision 13, that instituted new feed-in tariff, a little bit lower. So now looking at about 7 cents for ground-mounted solar, and then for floating solar, about 7.7 US cents. And that, if goes as planned, will lead to about another 1,500 megawatts here by the end of this year. So the key point here is they put in a support system. As the attorney said, I liked how she said market-making incentives, that made the market. And we saw about 5,000 megawatts come online quite shortly, and they didn't stop there. They followed it on, and we're now probably going to see another 1,000 to 1,500 megawatts just of utility scale solar towards the end of this year. Then rooftop solar, that has also had its own story and its own fantastic growth over the last year or so. That's been led by a feed-in tariff. So any excess solar that was not used on site by the consumer, whether it's the house or the factory, can be sold back to the utility at that feed-in tariff rate, which was previously 9.35 cents and is now a touch lower at 8.38. It's also important to point out that the government designed the system to up to 1 megawatt. So we're seeing some quite sizable systems there where we really are enabling large energy users to go out and procure large rooftop solar systems and make a true dent, a true impact in their clean energy objectives. And if things are going as they are right now, and I'll show you a graph here in a moment, there will be up to 1,000 megawatts, or at this pace, maybe even more by the end of this year. So again, really, really impressive growth there. I'll just pause here for a second for people to see it. I think I've spoken to most of these numbers. The main point of this is it really has gone from almost zero all the way up to beyond 5,000 megawatts of utility scale solar, and blew past that initial target of 850 megawatts, well past 5,000. Rooftop solar, again, has its own story. I talked about it already. Here's the numbers behind that. This right here, just here over the last 5 months, these numbers, this is the start of this year. And I think we're talking about COVID-19 and the impacts to renewable energy growth in different countries. I think some people might expect that this graph might flatten out. and plateau a bit given the pandemic. In fact, it's actually gone up. It's only sped up. If you see the growth here, we've gone almost 300 megawatts. This is as of the end of this last month. So we're well on our way to, I think, a gigawatt of rooftop solar by the end of this year. Worth highlighting here that approximately 2/3 of those rooftop solar investments are happening from the commercial and industrial sector. So that really goes to show that if you put in a landscape and lay the groundwork for those large energy users to go transact, it will happen. I won't talk through much here. Basically, it's the same story with wind. Wind has not quite grown as yet, but the main point being is those market-making mechanisms, particularly feed-in tariffs, are now in place and expected to be extended to 2023. I think we're waiting to see that here in the next, actually any day now. I think that's expected to be confirmed. But the short of it being, the government has put in a quite attractive framework for both onshore and offshore wind to grow, and we're looking at some very sizable targets and expectations. It depends on who you talk to, but I think looking at multiple gigawatts of wind, offshore and onshore, are expected here in the coming 5 years. One important point here, as well as on the solar, this right here is really important to highlight. Hong, my colleague Hong, will note this in a minute. The feed-in tariff is really just the first step. That's for the price discovery, but all of these different technologies are starting to move towards auctions, to a more competitive approach. So yes, feed-in tariffs have been important, but that's just the first step of the renewable energy sector growth in Vietnam. The DPPA pilot program, again, deserves probably its own entire presentation. It's just worth highlighting here that, looking at the electricity sector, or the electricity market in Vietnam, traditionally has been a fully monopolized system run by EVN, the state-owned utility. A few years ago, they put a plan in place to have about a decade-long or even more liberalization process. They really engaged and have shown their willingness to support this DPPA pilot program, which is essentially the first time a private generator is allowed to engage and transact in electricity sale, buying and selling with a private energy user. So this is very much a game changer in terms of Vietnam's power system, particularly for large energy users looking to procure large quantities of renewable energy, which just up until this point has been quite difficult other than rooftop solar. Also really important to point out here that the government didn't come out, this is called a pilot program. Some people might think, okay, maybe that's 50 megawatts or 100 megawatts. No, they actually are looking right now, as it stands, to up to 1,000 megawatts in this pilot program. So I'd have to, tip my hat to the Vietnam government to really come out and do something quite large and quite impactful from the get-go. With that, I think it's my time is up, and I'll pass the microphone over to my colleague Hong. I'm going to continue controlling the slides, but Hong, if you want to take over the microphone, the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you very well. Okay. Yeah, sounds good.
Thank you, Evan, for a great presentation. So hello, everyone. Good morning from Vietnam. My name is Hang Dao. I'm advisor of CEIA Vietnam. And first of all, I'd like to thank Marlon, NREB, and CEIA the Philippines for having us here. Is an extremely honor for us, Evan and I, to be sitting with tremendously experienced analysts from the Philippines, and we're looking forward for a more fruitful discussion afterward. So as Evan has shown you a very exciting and encouraging pictures of renewables growth in Vietnam, so I like to start with our natural next question is that how has the renewables growing and expanding so fast in Vietnam? What and what the elements and factors that drive the industry forward? So what I want to highlight in this slide is that we see the interest and the support of the government of Vietnam that's laid the foundation for this growth. and which is the government create a conducive investment environment through the pricing mechanism called feed-in tariff and net implemented and has been proven, giving a very successful growth, able to give incentive and stimulate the market, including the investors and buyers. And also we see the willingness of the government to make adjustment and clarification whenever it needed to the related stakeholder, whenever it's needed clarification from regulation or from the policy. And how is the government, the Vietnamese government, able to do that? Because they also are willing to engage with private sector to variety of public consultation, requests for public comments, also expert comment, whenever they release a draft decision. And because of that, the government recognized the role of the private sector. And I want to also to emphasize here is that it is where the organization like CEIA and other CSO and NGO play the role that bridge. We are the bridge between the private sector and the market and the industry to the government, to the policymakers. And so the next point I want to mention is that the government is not only showing support to the supplier side, to the producer side, but also the private sector from the buyers, from the demand side itself. So it shows in the sub of the EVN, which is the Vietnam state-owned monopoly. The rooftop solar in Vietnam, also very interested in implementing or experimenting a new. We will see in the coming PPA that Evan just mentioned. And so we see in the coming year the pilot of the auction scheme, the floating solar, expect to come in the next year. Next, please. Next slide, please. All right. So, who are the players? Who are the key players and stakeholders in this growth? I want to emphasize that this will be subjective if we say the government alone can drive the this growth and can drive the whole industry forward. What I mean is this is we see this new industry is an ecosystem that we have multiple stakeholders and any player play a significant role in this industry, including the utilities and the subsidies, including the power producers and the role in the transmission and distribution. And of course, we also have the very eager buyers and sellers themselves who are willing to learn and learning by doing, from residents owners, from business owners, from industry, and the developers themselves. What we observe and we see from the market in Vietnam is still a new growing industry and new market in Vietnam. So from the government to the utilities to the buyers and sellers, we are learning by doing ourselves, and people willing to learn and to adjust as the market grows. And last but not least, we cannot run a sustainable market and industry without the joining of finances. We also see the interest, the raising interest of domestic bank as well as the international bank as well as the development finance institution, and also a more innovative and new financial models such as the crowdfunding. And that all of the finance mechanism, we see that in place in Vietnam, and also more innovative financial model coming in the next few years. Next, please.
And then Dr. Hang, we only have like 2 minutes for your
Okay,
presentation.
so I'll be quick. So I like to draw some key lessons learned from the very impressive growth of the renewables in Vietnam. So first of all, the pricing discovery to feed-in tariff mechanism is obviously showing a very effective mechanism to stimulate the market, and what we'll see is gradually move forward to more competitive mechanism like auction. And also we also observe and see that Vietnam have more than enough the availability of capital and the participation from both local and regional investors. That, as Evan mentioned, if you remember, that in the next 10 years will be a very 10 critical years for Vietnam. Dollar invest in order to meet the target. And regarding this point, I also want to highlight the challenging and the challenge. And first, we see a impressive growth and very encouraging figures, but we also have to be honest and be frank to each other that the risks remain on the uncertainty of the policy itself, and also regarding to the availability of the capital. In short, we don't have the shortage of investor or investment interest, but the PPA power purchase agreement still deemed unbankable by most investors, and that one of the factors that discourage the investor interest into the industry. And also the power infrastructure and the grid have to be much more improved and upgrade in Vietnam in order to reduce curtailment and of course ultimately cause the unhappy investors.
Dr. Hank, can we wrap up as well?
Yes.
Sorry.
The next, I have the last slide. Maybe give him 1 more minute.
Yeah, 30 seconds maximum, because we're.
Okay, so I'd like to end the presentation by related to the power development plan in Vietnam, to the open-ended question that if the electricity plan in the next 10 years of Vietnam will be the plan for renewable energy era. That's is open more question than answer at this moment regarding to the role of the coal share in the national energy mix, as well as the commitment of Vietnam to the Paris Climate Agreements that we signed in 2015. And last but not least, that globally we've been suffering an impact from COVID-19, but is it either harm or benefit or have any effect on Vietnam renewable energy growth is still I'd like to end my presentation here, and thank you very much for your attention. Thank you, Marlon, Rabia.
And thank you, Dr. Hang, and thank you, Evan. And then we would have everyone in the interactive discussion later. I have a few questions myself, but at this juncture, we've heard from the policymakers and our Vietnam-based resource persons, and we are now eager to really hear the perspective of an RE developer who has experience developing in both markets. Next slide, please, Gabriel. I am glad to welcome Mr. John Eric Francia, President and CEO of AEC Energy, Ayala Corporation's energy arm, to present and share his insights based on his company's experience in the Philippines and Vietnam. Mr. Francia, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you. Thanks, Marlon, and good morning to everyone. Trust everyone is keeping well. I'm delighted to participate in this dialogue and share our experiences in developing renewables, both in the Philippines and Vietnam. and thoughts on how to further accelerate the renewables transition. On the next slide, next slide please, yes. Let me provide first a quick overview of AC Energy. We're very much a young company, just established in 2011 from a standing start. Our very first investment was a modest 50% stake in Northwind, or the equivalent of 16 megawatts of capacity. From there, we grew very quickly. First in the Philippines, participating very actively in the country's feed-in tariff program. Then in 2016, we ventured overseas, particularly in Indonesia with the acquisition of Chevron's geothermal plants together with consortium partners, as well as investing in the first wind farm in Indonesia. And then in 2018, we decided to enter the Vietnamese market. We've heard from our Vietnamese colleagues about the government's strong commitment towards renewables with a compelling feed-in tariff program. So today, as you'll see in the chart, we have over 1,000 megawatts of attributable capacity in renewables in operations and under construction. Philippines and Vietnam are our largest markets, and we are heavily invested in solar and wind technologies. Next slide shows AC Energy's goal is to reach 5,000 megawatts of renewables by 2025. Quite ambitious, but we believe that this can be attained. This is part of the company's transition to a low carbon portfolio. We just promulgated our ENS policy, which involves the commitment to divest all our coal assets by 2030. To help realize our goals, we have developed a robust pipeline of renewable projects around the region, and we also have plans to expand beyond the 3 markets we're in now to include Australia, India, and Myanmar. Next slide talks about our thoughts on Philippines and Vietnam, both of which will continue to be high priority renewable markets for AC Energy. As you may know, any investor would look at several important elements prior to investing in any market. I have here listed down 7 of these important elements, and allow me to share my views and insights on Philippines and Vietnam markets across these 7 factors. First, I'd like to call out here the tight supply situation in Vietnam, which Evan mentioned earlier. Next year is expected to be under supply situation. The country has been growing at 10% per annum, and coal plants have been delayed partly due to challenges in financing. And then in terms of renewables, the feed-in tariff regime has been a strong commitment from the Vietnamese government. And one of the reasons why I think the government has been able to support such a strong commitment is because the pricing of renewables have actually gone close to grid parity at 8 cents, 9 cent level. That is pretty much competitive with gas and just slightly a tad above the cost of coal, which is somewhere between 7 to 8 US cents per kilowatt hour. So not surprisingly, the government, while they were targeting just 850 or almost a gigawatt of solar, this was exceeded 5 times. Philippines, on the other hand, had an early go with the feed-in tariff program, as we all very well know. But as we also know, significant coal capacity was built in the past decade. Now, I've been addressing some of the Q&A online. We started this decade with about 5 gigawatts of coal, and we have built, by 2021, we will have around 12 gigawatts of coal capacity. That's 7 gigawatts of coal produced as opposed to RE, which has been only around 2 gigawatts of addition in the past decade. So there is an looming oversupply in the Philippines, and we only expect supply-demand equilibrium to be reached sometime in 2022 and 2023. That's why I think that we have also seen a pause in renewables development after the first wave driven by the feed-in tariff. But the next big thing that industry participants are looking at would be the renewable portfolio standards, which is a key driver for the next wave of renewables growth. And I'll talk about that more later. In terms of market framework, obviously, Philippines has an excellent framework, by no means perfect, but at least the market forces are there. And the private sector, this could spur private sector led development, as opposed to Vietnam, which is still dependent on the government sector. Having said that, we heard about the direct PPA program being piloted in Vietnam. In terms of resource and transmission, I'll just bundle point 4 and 6 together. I think both Philippines and Vietnam have similarities. Both have decent, not super great, but decent solar and wind resource in the high teens capacity factor in terms of solar, and in the high 20s, low 30s, mostly in wind. No, so decent resource to nurture both solar and wind capacities. Transmission is an issue. We've heard that theme earlier, and I'll emphasize this moving forward as an enabler to RE growth. And both Philippines and Vietnam have a lot of work to do in terms of transmission upgrades if we are to realize the full potential of renewables. Land is one of the elephants in the room. Our experience in Vietnam has been surprisingly positive in terms of land perfection. It is inextricably linked to the MOIT approval, so there is a natural execution flow from getting an MOIT or the main government approval up to land compensation for the landowners. No? In the Philippines, the timelines are very lengthy in terms of conversion, sometimes even dealing with indigenous people and so forth, right-of-way issues and so forth, as well as expropriation. So this is really one big opportunity for the Philippines to address if we are to unlock the potential of renewables. Last and not least is financeability. I think in the Philippines, we continue to have solid liquidity, strong liquidity among the financial institutions, a lot of credit-worthy off-takers. So I don't see financing as an issue in the Philippines. In the Vietnam, this was highlighted. Our resource speakers also highlighted the bankability concerns. Although to be quite frank, Vietnam surprised to the upside in terms of financing. Who would have thought that the 1 gigawatt of solar was financed, 5 gigawatts of solar outperformed 5 times the target, and a lot of the domestic and regional banks supported the program. On the next slide, shifting gears, just to align with Mona's presentation earlier, this is my more hopeful and optimistic view of renewables. I really believe, and we as a company support the Philippines' goal of going back to the 35% share of renewables. No, it's in 2008 when the RE law was passed, as Mona pointed out earlier, renewables was already at 34% of output. And today we are just at 21%. And a lot of the reason is because we built, we fueled our growth in the past decade by these 7 gigawatts of coal plants and some gas plants versus just 2,000 megawatts of renewables with a lower capacity factor. So we need to examine what does it take to get back to 35%. Let's just get some facts straight here, which is flashed on your screen. Let's talk about output in terms of megawatt hours first. So let's not confuse it with capacity, which is stated in megawatts. You'll see that in 2019, the demand was 106 terawatt hours. So that's like 106 billion kilowatt hours. And of which 21% was from renewables, or 22 terawatt hours was provided by renewables. If we assume that national demand will grow 4.8% per year, which is same as the last 20 years, then total output for in 2030 will be 178 terawatt hours. Simple multiplication, multiply that by 35%, which is our aspiration. That means that renewables have to be producing 62 terawatt hours, or tripling of our 22 terawatt hours of renewables today. So that's adding 40 terawatt hours of renewables over the next 10 years. So in other words, from 106 to 178, which represents 72 terawatt hours of growth that we expect in the Philippines over the next decade, 55% of that growth should be renewables, or 40 terawatt hours, if we are to achieve the 35% target. So that's simple mathematics. No? On the next slide is a view, a scenario. This is not official. This is just a scenario that AC Energy is putting forward, for consideration. We believe that to attain this ambitious goal, we believe that around 20 gigawatts of incremental renewables should be built and can be built in the next decade. No? The 20 gigawatts build out, so this is on top of the 7.4 gigawatts installed capacity that we have today, assumes a certain renewables mix that is dominated, we believe, by solar. No? So if you'll see on the right-hand side, this solar-driven scenario, or the RE mix that we would like to put forward as a scenario, is solar, 15 gigawatts of new capacity, followed by wind of 3 gigawatts, hydro with 1 gigawatt, and then geothermal and biomass with 500 megawatts each. Caveat, these are just assumptions. In one scenario, there may be certain permutations, but I'm willing to bet that this mix stands the best chance of success, give or take a few percentage points. No? Why do we believe in the solar-driven RE mix? If you look at the next slide, since flattening the curve is in vogue these days, one of the headlines here is the solar-driven RE mix helps flatten the curve, and I'll explain that in a bit. No? But on the left-hand side, you will see some of the few key points why a solar-driven RE mix or RE growth is compelling. Number one, it has now the lowest levelized cost of electricity. No? Globally and in the Philippines, it is already competitive. The only caveat is it's cheapest whenever the sun is shining. So we're not yet addressing the issue on reliability. No? And then second, there's flexibility in terms of size and location. You can put it in the load center, which is good. It relieves grid transmission constraints and so forth. And you also can diversify the location to address the resource reliability risk as well. It is relatively predictable. Intermittency can be addressed by storage. And I think one of the more important facets of solar is, at least in the Philippines context, it produces at the right time of the day and right time of the year. It's no surprise that solar has outperformed expectations in various neighboring markets. Vietnam, which was talked about a lot. In Australia, there's 14 gigawatts of solar out of a total demand of over 30 gigawatts. India, again, has grown quickly over the last few years, 38 gigawatts. Now they're targeting 100 gigawatts by 2022. And then in China, a staggering 205 gigawatts of installed solar capacity. Now, what about this flattening the curve? I think this is an interesting, a little bit technical, but we try to simplify it. This is, I'm showing here on the right-hand side, a typical daily load. This is based on Luzon demand on the different intervals. Right now, it peaks at around interval 14 or 2 p.m. You can see here a couple of peaks, interval 11, 14, and a nighttime peak of around at interval 19. What solar does, what we've done is that we grew based on that 4.8% assumption. We grow that in 2030, and we believe that if we had 10 gigawatts of solar by 2030, that 10 gigawatts will fill up that orange portion. That's the first part of flattening the curve, right? So it's perfect match in terms of addressing that daytime peak from intervals 14 to 19. No? Then we can further flatten the curve with another opportunity. You see the light orange side there between intervals 18 to 24. If you overproduce, let's say another 5 gigawatts of solar during the daytime, store it, all you need would be around 2.5 gigawatts times 6 hours of storage to spread it over night. Of course, over the evening time. Of course, this assumes that storage will be competitive priced at that time. Now, again, let me just pause here. And while it's hard to crystal ball, you've seen the NREB 2011 to 2030 plan that Mona showed, less than 300 megawatts of solar planned for by 2020, because that plan was done close to 2010, where solar was at 18 pesos per kilowatt hour. Today, solar is closer to 4 or even sub 4 pesos per kilowatt hour. Who would have known, right? Who would have foreseen that? And therefore now, that 300 megawatts is like a joke and has been outperformed by our outcomes, no more than 3 times. I submit that same thing could happen for storage. Right now, storage is about $300,000 per megawatt hour, upwards of $300,000 per megawatt hour. The benchmark that everyone is looking at is sub $100,000 per megawatt hour. Will make this scenario possible, and experts say that in the next 5+ years, that will become a reality, if not faster. No. Next slide, please. So one of the key enablers in reigniting these RE investments, if we are to believe this RE mix and solar-driven mix, is the renewable portfolio standards. This will move the needle a lot. No, and RPS promising policy, the current minimum prescribed by law and already decided by DOE and with advice from NREB is 1% incremental annual increment. It's a good start, but if we just stuck to that, and these are our estimates in terms of how many gigawatts of renewables have to be built every year, starting end of 2023, assuming a 23% capacity factor, which is the weighted average of the solar-driven RE mix. No, while it's a good start, this will only get us, based on our projections, to 26% share of output, falling way short of the 35% aspiration that we all have. No, this requires 11 gigawatts, roughly, of cumulative RE incremental capacity by 2030. If we are serious about achieving 35% RE by 2030, then the 1% would have to be adjusted sometime in 2025 to around 2.5% annual increment. And you now go to the right hand of the slide, which is basically the 20 gigawatt portfolio that we're talking about. This would get us to 35% share of output. No. So again, I think I was discussing with Mona earlier this morning that 2.7 gigawatts is enough of a challenge for us developers to make sure that we can deliver against a 2.7, because it would be risky for our regulators or policymakers to put that objective, that threshold very high, because if we don't deliver as developers, then you might end up with a very high REC, the renewable certificate pricing. No, so I think it would be good to start conservative at 1%, but the moment that we show that we can deliver against a 2.7, I think it would be good for the policymakers to be ahead of the curve and pose a higher target so that we can build on the momentum as opposed to derail that momentum. Next slide, please. So I'm almost done here, but I just want to draw some lessons learned from Vietnam, and I also brought in some Australia experience only because they've got a very successful renewable portfolio standard market as well, or framework. No, I think for policy to be truly effective, to be truly potent, which we want to really drive renewable investments, the policy framework should have high conviction, should be very meaningful and predictable. And these are some of the lessons learned. Now, conviction, I think, is very important. We've seen that in Vietnam and in Australia. I think the belief that RE can be a cost-effective way to address the energy requirements Vietnam, we've seen that you know, this is a way out for Vietnam out of this supply crunch. Australia was actually a mixed experience because of the government change, but even the ruling coalition, which is not entirely pro RE, was surprised at the effectiveness of renewables, and the cost didn't get to the high end, didn't get too expensive, contrary to their expectation. And Australia was able to reach their 33 terawatt hour target by 2020. They reached it in September 2019, 1 year ahead. You know, and they've seen the REC cost, the cost of those green certificates decline as the target was reached. So I think conviction is very important that this will be a cost-effective solution longer term. Second is meaningfulness. I think one of the great examples in Australia is you need policy that can be enforced. No, you want policy that has teeth. And the way it did it was they had a realistic penalty level of 65 Aussie dollars per megawatt hour if you are not compliant with your REC requirements or RPS requirements. No. This was even much higher than the spot market at that time, but as I mentioned, that cost declined over time. Vietnam Wind at first had 7.8 US cents, not too meaningful to investors. The equation didn't work, but once they moved that to 8.5 cents, then a whole bunch of wind investments came through as well. Predictability is also important. In Australia, there was a slowdown in RE investments when they changed the policy from 41 terawatt hours. The labor, the coalition government moved that to 33 terawatt hours. Now, so there was a little bit of policy confusion that derailed it. So here are some policy considerations for our policy makers. I think we need to be committed to the 35% RE goal. We need to set reasonable penalty levels, or at least the price cap should be reasonable enough to create a robust market. And perhaps you can also auto-trigger or put in mechanisms which provide the industry participants more visibility in terms of that 1% threshold moving up to a higher threshold. So in summary, the last page, please. Next slide. Yeah, sorry. Okay. These are just the key takeaways. I think that 35% RE is very much possible. We need to really integrate RE expansion to the transmission with the transmission development plan. This is very, very critical. We need to incorporate storage, increase regulating reserves, and master plan this. And I hope, I trust that DOE, I'm glad that USEC Wimpy is here. You know, collaboration with NGCP is very, very critical in this process. Streamlining the land conversion process will also unlock, again, the potential of renewables in the Philippines. And of course, implementation of RPS and other enabling policies with conviction, meaningfulness, and predictability. We believe that this could happen, that will make this happen. And these are the elements to make this big aspiration a reality. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Mr. Francia. And now we are actually borrowing extra 15 minutes of your time because we would really like, we have assembled this distinguished panel of speakers and panelists, and we just go back to the modest proposal of presented by Mr. Francia that to attain 35% renewables, the industry has to build out 20 gigawatts in 10 years of renewables. And we have here our panelists, Chairman Agnes, Yusek Pentabella, and Dr. Attorney Mona, as well as Evan and Hang. And can you chime in on what policy and regulatory items, apart from implementing the RPS with conviction, meaningfulness, and predictability, are needed from the Philippine government side for the 20 gigawatts needed RE by 2030 to be realized in such an orderly manner?
This is Yusek Fuentebella. If I may begin, we have the green energy auction that supports the the renewable portfolio standards, because what we are doing is we are facilitating the contracting or the auction that ends up with the contracts between the supplier and the distribution utilities that are required to comply with the minimum of 1%. So it's not 1% threshold in the sense that it's the maximum, it is the minimum. Secondly, we are also working with the banks so that they would fully understand how to fund all these renewable energy projects. Thirdly, as we mentioned earlier, the timelines for us, not only for the Department of Energy, not only for the Energy Regulatory Commission, but also for the other agencies, as mentioned by our developer panelists here, the NCIP, the National Commission on Indigenous Peoples, and even the Department of Agriculture in the land conversions, we have specific timelines and online payments and online processing of all the permits. And it's not the Department of Energy that's heading the steering committee. It's the President of the Republic of the Philippines. It's the Office of the President that chairs the steering committee for the Energy Virtual One-Stop Shop Act implementation. So that's the commitment. And at the end of it all, what we are looking at, the Philippines is looking at the needs of the consumers. Because most of the time when we hear the feed-in tariff system, it seems that it is based looking into suppliers' targets. 35% of the mix should be from RE. But we have to look into the price as well. That's why our partnership with the ERC is very important, because we want to bring down the prices. And we don't want to come out with policies that will drive prices and we will blame each other later. So at the end of the day, it's demand-driven, it's consumer-centered, and that's what the Philippines is looking into. We commend what Vietnam has been doing. We commend the developers for their actions and giving us government ways to improve. And I hope we continue to have this harmonized approach so that our commitment to have a cleaner and more reliable energy system will be realized.
Marlon, hi.
Yes.
This is Attorney Mona. I just want to add to what Yusek Wimpy was saying, even on Eric's point on RPS. So all these programs, I think we all have to remember we're operating within the framework of the RE Act, and the programs mandated by the RE Act. Among those programs, the key one would be at this point the RPS and the Green Energy Option Program. So we're really focusing all the efforts, all the support programs there. And the auction, the Green Energy Auction, is one of those implementing elements for achieving the objectives of those programs. Even for the RPS, taking off from what Eric had said about the targets, and that 1% will not get us there by 2030. That's already realized among the RPS composite team members. There's an RPS composite team that's monitoring the RPS implementation. So we are prepared to increase that number so that we get to the target. So the solution here is we're seeing that we're far from the target. We're actually moving away from the target over the last decade or so. So how do we get back on track and get us back to the target? So the thinking is already there, the exercise is already there, the creativity, in fact, on the programs is already there, as evidenced by all these new initiatives from the DOE, from the ERC as well. And I think what is encouraging, as I take off from what Chair Agnes had said later, is that, and I was really thrilled when she said that we're entering the golden age of RE. The encouraging fact is that the agencies are moving together, are aligned in getting us to that target. Even the what Yusek Pimpi had said, that at the end of the day, it has to be demand driven. It should not result in higher prices for our consumers. We're all aligned in that objective, and we are at this point, I think, that RE can already stand on the same stage as non-RE resources in terms of cost competitiveness. Of course, there will be, that's why I was talking about resource-specific programs later. earlier, because there are some resources that really need to be supported by specific programs like geothermal, for example. I really, this is close to heart because I know we in the Philippines, we have been proud about the fact that we were #2 in terms of geothermal producers in the world, but now we're already third, because as the numbers had shown earlier, in the last 10 years, we've only added 82 megawatts of geothermal. But geothermal is unique. So we will craft specific programs to support geothermal. But in terms of LCOE and all these cost parameters, we should be able to, and I speak about RE, we should be able to have RE fight or compete alongside others, because at the end of the day, it has to make sense to the consumers why they're choosing RE. So we need to make our case on that basis.
I absolutely agree, Mona. Marlon, if I may just jump in here, I absolutely agree that it has to make sense to consumers from a cost perspective as well, not just the environmental sustainability perspective. No, and I think that's the beauty of why solar is the lead candidate for this. Yeah. If you recall my orange part earlier, if you just look at the historic price of peaking capacity or daytime peak, no, in the Philippines over the last 10 years, guess what the average cost is? It's 5 pesos and 70 centavos, more or less. Over the last 5 years, that has gone down to around 5 pesos 20 centavos. It's in the 5 handle. If you look at the recent competitive bid of Meralco on the mid-merit, the price was somewhere in the 5 plus peso, consistent with historic norms. And it's great that ERC, thanks Chair for reinforcing that CSP of Meralco that validated the open and competitive nature of the CSP. So what this tells us is we have an established price for that peak load, and we know that solar can beat that. No, that's why I'm bullish about this 10 gigawatt solar. You don't need storage or massive storage to be able to provide that quantity, no, by 2030. Where there is a bit of a challenge now is storage, because storage now on a per kilowatt hour basis at $300,000 per megawatt hour, that would translate to approximately 5 to 6 pesos per kilowatt hour to store electricity. Mahal. So you add that to solar, it doesn't make sense. It can displace diesel in an off-grid area, but not on an on-grid. But once that number goes down to sub $100,000 per megawatt hour, then you are in the 1 to 2 peso per kilowatt hour range. Then it's game on. Hopefully by that time, solar will also reduce from 4 pesos to closer to 3 pesos per kilowatt hour. No, so that solar plus storage can actually provide that evening peak also at very competitive price, sub 5 pesos. No. So all of this has to make sense, but I think solar standalone is already there. Solar plus storage for the evening, we're not there yet, but again, hopefully we will get there.
And with that statement, I would like to ask Chairman De Vanadera if these kinds of technologies like storage and microgrids, where are we there? Where are we now in terms of like adopting this and then being ready once these inflection points in the economics are indeed achieved? Because we are really seeing technology costs declining so fast, and in the industry evolving so fast, and it seems like somehow regulatory items are playing catch up on this. What are we doing now to lay the groundwork so that we are ready once this happens?
Okay, thank you so much for leading me to the topic that I want to discuss. Well, we have, as I stated a while ago, our target for the regulatory framework, provided that policies have been finalized by DOE. All this will have to be done this year. And there are some points that we're looking into. For example, on the intermittency problems that our RE developers and consumers are now confronted. So what is now the role of batteries, and how much of the cost of batteries will go into this? to be able to attain the standard, the reliability standard that we want to have. Now, for the battery, there's also something that we have to settle, which is whether the battery storage will be treated as capex or as PSA. Now, it will really depend on how you present it to ERC. And because this is something new, we are going out of the box by sitting down first with the prospective applicant so that we can better understand exactly their relationship, the relationship of the battery owner, the relationship of the DU, even our electric cooperatives. That is an issue that we have to settle, and we're getting there. We also have now there are some models where CFP is almost skipped. CFP is not pursued, and that is something that we always give emphasis that we cannot do the roundabout by not having the CFP, because that is one of the big issues that we have had in in the energy sector, and no less than the Supreme Court has given emphasis on the need to have the competitive selection process in order to attain the best price. Now, also we are looking into the hybrid systems because we all know that in some areas we have so much of the diesel plants, and we have been promoting and pushing for the hybrid system so that as a transition we can have the RE. These are the off-grid areas, and therefore the hybrid system is very ideal. We're actually at the end of the line because what we will really have to determine is and to compute is the rate. Now, another example that we saw is the proposal to have a fixed rate for all technologies. What now we are evaluating is, will this not give undue advantage to some and really marginalize, or it will not be justifiable for the other types of technology? We are going back to the hybrid system that we are really advocating. It becomes very, very significant now, considering that in off-grid areas, these are mostly residential. There are areas though that would combine the tourism and the residential. But this development, these new developments because of COVID affecting the change in the demand profile, should really make the regulator look into priorities, look into costing, look into the proposals in a manner that we never did before. So that's why it's very important that that NREB, DOE, the private sector, and even the banks should really come together every now and then. And taking our learnings from Vietnam, we have a lot to do. And we're very happy that we were given this opportunity, because we're seeing that liberalization has influenced how we have moved RE and the energy sector, I suppose, and the open access, and the auction may still be one of the best things that can happen here in the Philippines, because again, this will level the playing field. It may also affect the internal processes in the Energy Regulatory Commission, because what do we do with the price after it has gone through an auction? So these are the things that really, these are new developments, and ERC should be excited about it, and I think the energy sector should really be excited about this. And the zoning, another thing that is very important because it will guide the regulator. Once the OE has done with the zoning, then it will guide also the regulator on exactly how we will do and evaluate the proposals. So those are the high points at this time.
Okay. Thank you, Chairman Agnes. We're definitely excited, and then we are happy to hear about your thoughts and insights about leveling the playing field and out-of-the-box solutions for storage, and with the end goal of really making this impactful and meaningful to the consumers by bringing secure, sustainable, and affordable energy supply. Unfortunately, we are well past time, and we do not want to be the one coming between you and your lunch. We are taking note of all questions, and the CEIA, the Clean Energy Investment Accelerator, aims to gather answers post virtual dialogue from ERC, NREB, and DOE on such questions. With that, thank you to our esteemed panelists, Attorney Mona de Malanta. Yes?
Mr. Moderator, yeah. I would just like to state that the Department of Energy came out with a smart grid policy. We would invite also our participants to inform us how we can further improve on the same, because it's a framework and the details have to be fleshed out. So that's in support of Ma'am Agnes's enumeration of what they're doing, and also on what we will do for the microgrid systems and the systems that uses technologies. Thank you.
Great. Noted on that, USEC. Smart for the RE developers here. The smart grid policy is up for consultation and comments, and it would be great if everyone can come together and inform on how to sharpen that policy as we look at this golden age of RE, so to speak, with these ambitious goals and making sure that the storage, that we are ready to take in storage-based solutions to our grid. So thank you for that, USEC, Pentabella. Thank you as well, Mr. Eric Francia, and our colleagues from Vietnam, Mr. Evan Scanling and Dr. Hang Dao. And of course, we always appreciate having this space time with Chairman Agnes de Vanadera. Thank you for your leadership and for giving us your precious time today. And we hope that this will be just the first of a series of virtual dialogues. Attorney Mona, we would be really glad to co-host and support you in this endeavor. We would
Thank you, Marlon.
the services of the Clean Energy Investment.
Maybe on behalf of the National Renewable Energy Board as well, I'd like to thank Chairman Agnes, Yusek Wimpy, Eric, and our colleagues from Vietnam for sharing their wisdom more than anything else, sharing their wisdom with us this morning. And thank you for accommodating our request to join us in the panel. Maraming salamat po.
Okay, thank you everyone for joining us today. And if you wish to contact me and continue the conversation, I can be reached via my LinkedIn page. And we will be happy to take note of all these questions, cascade it to the audience, and make sure that we have answers for all these. With that, enjoy the rest of the week. This week marks the week of the Asia. To see you there as we continue these conversations in accelerating the RE transition of the Philippines. With that, thank you very much, and we hope to see you again very soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.